I'm Samantha Cooper, 37, and I spent 17 years building something that almost no one in my family ever asked to see. I trained military working dogs for the Navy, starting on the ground at Lackland, ending up as the director of the program that places every operational canine in the SEAL teams. I sacrificed events and holidays and easy explanations, and I did it quietly, because the work required that. What I didn't expect was that the person who finally made my family understand all of it wasn't me. It was a Belgian Malinois named Ranger who crossed a bar to find me 6 months after I'd placed him with the team, because he knew my voice before anyone in that room knew my name. Have you ever given everything to a job that the people closest to you couldn't quite see? If so, tell me your story in the comments. You're not alone. Before I get into what happened, let me know where you're tuning in from. And if you've ever had to stand up for yourself after being quietly overlooked by someone who should have known better, hit that like button and subscribe. My father had a way of talking about the military that made it sound like a religion, not a job, not a service, but a calling that answered to very specific rules about what it meant to do it right. He had served 22 years in the Army, retired as a sergeant first class, and he wore those years the way other men wear their wedding rings, quietly, constantly, as the thing that defined everything else. I grew up hearing stories about his first posting in Germany, his 2 tours in the Gulf, the training exercises in the Mojave Desert where the ground was so hot it blistered through boot leather. He told these stories at the dinner table, on long car rides, on Sunday mornings when the rest of us were still in pajamas, and the coffee was still brewing, and the day had not yet made any demands of anyone. He had a gift for the telling. His stories had specific details: the weight of a pack, the sound of a checkpoint, the temperature inside a tent at 0300 hours, and those details were what made them feel real. He was proud in the way that men of his generation learned to be proud. Quietly, thoroughly, with a clear sense of the hierarchy of things worth being proud of, and the things that fell beneath that line. My mother, Rosa, was a registered nurse who worked long shifts at the county hospital and loved us with a practical efficiency that I came to understand, much later, was its own form of devotion. She didn't speak about her work the way my father spoke about his. She showed up and did it and came home and fed us and asked how our days had been, and she listened to the answers with the particular attentiveness of someone who spends 8 hours a day listening for what people aren't saying. She was the steadiest person I've ever known. She is still, by some distance, the steadiest person I've ever known. My brother Marco, 4 years younger than me, built like our father and wired in many ways like him, too, sat at that dinner table soaking all of it in. He learned early which qualities the household valued and organized himself around them. Endurance, visible achievement, results that could be pointed to and named. He was good at being in rooms. He understood instinctively how to make people comfortable, how to hold a crowd's attention, how to make his father smile across the table. He was not performing any of this. He was just, from a young age, very good at the visible world. I was different. Not softer than Marco, I want to be clear about that, because that word has followed me for most of my professional life, and it has never been accurate. Differently focused. While my father told stories about infantry maneuvers and forward operating bases, I was the one watching footage of military working dogs on the evening news. The Belgian Malinois and German Shepherds that cleared buildings and found buried explosive devices and sat beside their handlers in the desert with their ears turned toward sounds no human ear could catch. There was something in those animals that reached into me and would not let go. The discipline of them, the bond they formed with a single person to the exclusion of everything else. The way a working dog in harness becomes something beyond what it was alone, becomes a partner in the oldest and most serious sense of the word. I could not have explained any of this at 16. I just knew. I knew it the way you know some things before you have words for them. When I was 16, we watched a news segment about K-9 units in Afghanistan. My father watched for approximately 45 seconds before saying something about it being the soft side of the military. He did not mean it cruelly. He was not trying to diminish anything. He simply had a very particular idea of what soldiering looked like, and it was not this. Marco nodded along the way. He nodded along with most things our father said, shaping himself to the response in the room. My mother glanced across the table at me. I said nothing. I kept watching until the channel changed. By the time I graduated high school in the spring of 2006, the decision was entirely made in my own mind. I was enlisting in the Navy. I had researched the military working dog handler program, learned that the Navy ran its personnel through Lackland Air Force Base in San Antonio for handler certification, and understood from everything I could find that embedded canine teams were increasingly integrated into special operations environments in ways that were changing how those missions were conducted. I knew exactly what I was walking into. What I had not anticipated, what I had not allowed myself to think too carefully about, was my father's face when I told him. We were at the dinner table. It was late spring, 2006. I chose a Sunday because Sundays were the days he was most relaxed. He put his fork down and looked at me with the particular stillness he used when he was working very hard to maintain control of something. He said, "The Navy? What does the Navy have to do with service?" I told him about the canine handler program at Lackland, that it was a Navy program, that I would start in the fall. He said, "Playing with dogs, Samantha. We come from fighters." My mother looked at her plate. Marco, 14 years old, looked at our father and then at his own plate and said nothing. He was learning, in that moment, whose lead to follow. I had already signed the paperwork. There was nothing left to negotiate, and I had no desire to negotiate it. I had made my decision, and I was going to live inside it. I left for basic training in August of 2006. It was 101 degrees when the cab arrived that morning, the kind of heat that makes the air over the asphalt shimmer and ripple like water. My father stood in the driveway with his arms crossed and watched the cab pull away from the curb. He did not wave. My mother cried from the front step, one hand pressed flat against her collarbone, the way she does when she is trying not to make a sound. Marco gave me a quick, hard hug and went back inside before the cab had even reached the end of the street. I watched through the rear window until the road curved and I couldn't see the house anymore. Then I turned forward and watched where I was going instead. I have thought about that cab ride many times in the years since. Not with regret, I have never regretted the decision I made in that driveway, but with a kind of affection for the person I was in that back seat, watching the house disappear around a curve and deliberately turning to face forward. I was 18 years old, and I had made a decision that the people I loved most did not understand and could not support, and I was going toward it anyway. That is a particular kind of confidence, not arrogance, not bravado, but a quiet, internal orientation toward what you know to be right for you, regardless of who is watching or what they make of it. I did not know then that I would spend the next 17 years practicing that orientation in progressively higher stakes environments. I just knew I was going the right direction. Basic training was not the revelation it sometimes is for people who have never lived inside structure. I had grown up in a household that ran on it. The discipline of it, the rhythm of commands and responses and formation, felt less like something new and more like something familiar given a formal name. What surprised me was my own endurance, not the physical endurance, which I had spent months preparing for, but the endurance that comes from being quietly, completely certain about something in an environment that is specifically designed to shake you loose from whatever you were before. I had that certainty. I kept my head down and worked and did not complain and did not make enemies and did not flinch, and at the end of it, I stood in formation and felt something settle into place inside me that has stayed settled ever since. By the time I arrived at Lackland for K9 training, I was already good at disappearing into the work. My first assigned dog was a German Shepherd named Bravo, large and stubborn, and brilliant in the precise, purposeful way that working dogs are brilliant, with a drive to work that was as much a part of him as the color of his coat. The training instructors noted at the end of my first month that I had what they called an unusual rapport with working dogs. What they meant, I came to understand, was that the animals listened to me without my needing to raise my voice or establish dominance through volume. I was simply steady. I had learned steadiness in a kitchen in San Antonio and in a driveway at 101 degrees, and dogs recognize steadiness the way they recognize everything else. Completely, without reservation, without the complications that human recognition always involves. I called home from a payphone one Sunday afternoon and told my mother about Bravo. She listened carefully and asked if I was eating enough and told me to be careful. My father was not home. Marco answered briefly and said he had to go. I hung up the phone and walked back to the kennels and fed Bravo his evening meal and thought about almost nothing except the work in front of me. That was how it began, not with ceremony or a defining moment of clarity. Just a young woman and a dog and the slow, patient work of learning each other's language in a training center in the city where she had grown up. I was selected for Officer Candidate School in 2008. The Navy ran a commissioning program for enlisted personnel who had demonstrated a combination of academic record and leadership potential. and in my second year as a handler, I was selected. I was 20 years old. I went through OCS in Newport, Rhode Island, in the middle of a hard New England winter, sleet off the Atlantic, formations in the pre-dawn dark, the particular cold that settles into institutional buildings that are not quite heated enough. I was commissioned as an ensign in the spring of 2009, one gold stripe on the sleeve. The beginning of an officer's career inside the same institution with the same dogs and the same work, carrying an additional layer of responsibility that would deepen steadily over the years. My father's response to the commission was complicated. Officers were a different category from the one he had spent his career in. He had served under them his whole life without becoming one, and his relationship to the rank structure was calibrated specifically to the enlisted side of it. An ensign in the Navy was both more than he had expected, and still, somehow, not quite what he would have chosen for me. He did not say this directly. He said, "Well, that's something." My mother sent a care package with cookies and a card that said she was proud. Marco texted a single line, "Congrats, Samantha." I kept the card in my nightstand drawer for 6 years. The decade that followed was the decade of the work itself. I trained dogs. I deployed in embedded roles, supporting SEAL teams in operational environments I am not at liberty to describe in detail, alongside operators who had spent years becoming extraordinarily good at things the public neither knows about nor would necessarily want to know about. The K-9 units I supported contributed, in several situations I will not name, to the difference between a mission going clean and a mission going catastrophically wrong. I know this because I was present for those situations. I know it because the handlers and team leaders told me afterward, in the flat, specific language that people in those environments use for near misses and close calls. It found the device before the team reached the threshold. The structure was confirmed clear at 0400. We got all personnel out, simple sentences carrying enormous weight. None of this was something I could bring home. At the family reunion in the summer of 2015, a gathering in our aunt's backyard in San Antonio, oak trees and folding tables and a cooler full of ice. I was 27 years old and home on leave, wearing civilian clothes because my current assignment was classified, and I had no way of discussing it in any setting that included people without clearances. Marco was 23 and had just signed his second major commercial construction contract. He introduced his business partner to the assembled relatives, talked about the new development, strip malls, 36 commercial units, the culmination of 2 years of groundwork, and the family gathered around him the way people gather around visible success. Comfortable in its presence because they can name and measure it. My mother and I sat in lawn chairs at the edge of the yard and drank iced tea and watched. She put her hand on mine once and left it there. She didn't say anything. She understood without saying it that I was watching a version of the gap and that naming it wouldn't close it. Marco didn't look at me when he said real work. He didn't need to. I want to be careful about how I characterize what Marco was doing in that moment, because I have had years to think about it, and I don't think he was trying to diminish me. He was filling a silence. When you spend years being unable to say where you have been or what you have done, the people who care about you fill that silence with whatever material is available. Marco filled it with construction contracts and the approval of our father, and both of those things were real and legitimate and genuinely his. He was not wrong to be proud of them. He was just operating in a room where I had no visible presence, and he had never been asked to imagine what the room might look like if I did. The truth is that I had never asked him to imagine it either. I had kept the door of my professional life closed so thoroughly and for so long that Marco had stopped registering it as a door at all. It had become just a wall, unremarkable, part of the fixed architecture. I had done this partly out of classified necessity, and partly out of pride, and partly out of something harder to name. A reluctance to ask for understanding that I was not sure would arrive. If he could not find his way to the interest unprompted, some part of me did not want to prompt him. That was not entirely fair. I am able to see that now. In December of 2018, after 9 years of commissioned service and 1 promotion board, I was promoted to lieutenant commander, 2 gold oak leaves, a rank that meant in practical terms that I was now in a position to shape the program rather than simply serve within it. I called home from my apartment that evening. My father said good, and then told me that Marco had just landed his biggest contract yet, 36 units in North San Antonio, the one he'd been working toward for the better part of 2 years. He was flying. I held the phone and looked at the new rank insignia on my kitchen counter. I had set it there while I waited for the call to connect, the way you set a thing down when you want to look at it properly. 2 gold oak leaves. I looked at them for a moment, then I put them in my jacket pocket and went to make dinner and didn't mention the promotion again. I began training Ranger in the spring of 2021. He was 8 weeks old, a Belgian Malinois with a dark mask and ears already oversized for his narrow puppy head. The particular look of young working dogs, who were going to grow into something formidable. The Lackland kennels had produced exceptional animals before. I had trained many of them, but Ranger was different from the first morning, and I knew it before the week was out. He had the drive that defines the best working dogs, a focused, almost architectural desire to engage with the task in front of him. But on top of that, he had something I have only encountered a handful of times in 15 years of this work. A quality of attentiveness that I can only describe as a kind of listening. He was listening at all times. Not just to commands, to the room, to the people in it, to the quality of energy around him. He adjusted to information before anyone had finished delivering it. He noticed everything. I worked with him every day for 14 months. I kept a training log in a ruled notebook that I filled in each evening before bed. Not for the program's record, though I maintained that too, but for my own. Writing down the small daily changes is how you see the accumulation of them over time, and with Ranger, the accumulation was always the point. He was becoming something remarkable. I knew it before his certification was half finished, and I knew it with the specific certainty that comes from doing something long enough to recognize the distance between good work and exceptional work. He was exceptional. He was the best dog I had ever trained. I accepted this as a fact and continued doing the job. I signed his deployment paperwork in May of 2022. Ranger, 15 months old, fully certified, assessed as mission ready by every metric the program had, was assigned to a SEAL Team 3 element under Petty Officer First Class Jake Halverson. I reviewed Halverson's record before signing. Experienced, solid evaluations, a record of good instincts with working animals, and above-average integration outcomes with his previous canine partner. The placement was correct. I knew the placement was correct. I held Ranger's face in my hands before the transport arrived and looked at him for longer than I intended. And then I let him go. The van pulled out of the Lackland lot at 0900 hours on a morning in May. I stood in the parking lot with my hands in my jacket pockets and watched it until I couldn't see it anymore. Then I went inside and opened the file on the next cohort and started at the beginning. The following year, I was promoted to commander. The year after that, I was appointed director of the Naval Special Warfare K-9 Training Program. My father said on the phone, "That's quite a title." My mother sent a card and cookies. Marco texted, "Congrats, Samantha." I was 36 years old, and I ran the program that produced and placed every operational working dog in the SEAL teams. Almost no one outside that world knew what that entailed. Inside it, the program and the person running it were known precisely. My family had never been inside that world, and I had reached a point where I had accepted this as simply the nature of the work I had chosen. Some things you carry alone because there is no other option. Some gaps you live with because bridging them would require more explanation than either side has bandwidth for. I had not yet found out that this was not always and entirely true. My brother Marco had never visited San Diego. He had been promising for 3 years, construction deadlines, family obligations, the general busyness of a man whose life is conducted entirely in the visible and reachable world, where good intentions are never short of reasons to wait. In October of 2025, he bought the ticket. He flew out the first week of November, and we spent 6 days doing what you do when you are trying to cover old distance with new conversation. The waterfront, the zoo, a sunset cruise neither of us would have chosen independently, but that turned out to be genuinely pleasant. We were careful with each other. Siblings who have been politely estranged for long enough sometimes forget exactly where the estrangement began, and that forgetting is its own kind of progress. On Friday evening, the 5th day of his visit, I took him to a bar near Naval Amphibious Base Coronado. It was a bar I frequented occasionally. The clientele was almost entirely military, and the unspoken social language of the place was familiar to me without my having to perform it. I was still in the clothes from a long afternoon at my desk. Jeans, a blue blouse, my hair down. I was tired in a comfortable way and glad to have my brother nearby for a few more days and not thinking about much of anything except a quiet drink at the end of a long week. We found seats at the bar. I was looking at the menu when I heard it. A voice from the corner of the room. "Wrong bar, princess!" I looked up. 2 Navy SEALs were watching me from a corner table, young, the physical bearing unmistakable to anyone who had spent significant time in these environments. The particular kind of alert stillness that operators carry even off duty, the way they occupy a room. The one who had spoken was grinning with the easy confidence of a man who had never found his read of a situation to be wrong. His partner laughed. And my brother Marco, without thinking, without pausing to consider who was sitting beside him, reflexively and completely, chuckled and looked away. I did not look at Marco. I turned to the bartender. Whiskey. Neat. I had spent 17 years in rooms where no one knew what I had done. I was entirely accustomed to that invisibility. It was in many ways the condition of the work I had chosen. The seal in the corner was not the wound. What I noted, quietly, precisely, in the way that I have always noted things that matter, was that my own brother was sitting beside me while strangers reduced me to furniture, and he had found it mildly amusing. I filed that observation somewhere I knew I would need to return to. Then I sat with my drink and let the noise of the room close around me and said nothing. Several minutes passed. Marco and I were talking about the restaurant where we'd eaten that afternoon, a place on the waterfront with good fish and mediocre wine that we had both quietly decided to call a good experience. I was mid-sentence when I heard a sound that stopped me before I had consciously identified it. A low, urgent whine. The sound a Belgian Malinois makes when he has encountered something unexpected. I looked toward the corner table. The larger of the two seals had both hands on a dog's collar. A Belgian Malinois, 3.5 years old, dark-muzzled, with his ears rotated fully forward and his whole body oriented toward me. The dog was standing. He had not been standing a moment before. The seal was saying quietly and firmly, with the authority of a man who had never needed to repeat a command to this animal in the time he'd worked with him. Ranger, down. Ranger did not sit down. His tail began to move in the slow, weighted rhythm that signals recognition rather than simple excitement. His nose worked the air between us systematically. He took one deliberate step toward the bar, pulling both the seal's hands with him. He took a second step. The seal tightened his grip and repeated the command. Ranger took a third step and broke free of the collar grip without apparent effort or urgency, as though the command and the grip were both simply less important than what he was attending to, and walked the remaining distance to where I was sitting. He pressed his head against my knee with the settled, certain weight of an animal who has arrived exactly where he intended to arrive. Then he looked up at me and whined again, quieter this time, lower, the register of recognition rather than distress. The bar had gotten quieter around us. Jake Halverson came to the bar. He was apologetic and genuinely baffled, the specific quality of confusion that cannot be fabricated, because it comes from watching an animal you have trusted with your life do something it has categorically never done before, and being unable to construct any explanation for it. He apologized for the dog and said it had never happened before, not once, and he honestly did not know what to make of it. I looked down at the animal pressed against my leg. I said, "Hey, Ranger. 3 years. 3 years and 14 months of training and a parking lot in May and a transport van pulling away from the Lackland lot at 0900. He pushed his front paws up against the bar rail and his tail moved with a speed and force that put his entire hindquarters in motion, and he made a sound that I can only describe as happiness, the specific, unguarded sound of a dog who has found something he did not know he was missing. Dex Morales had come away from the table by now. Both men stood watching. Jake Halverson said, "You know his name." I said, "I trained him. At Lackland, starting when he was 8 weeks old. That was 3.5 years ago." He went still. The complete stillness of a man revising a significant set of assumptions in real time, reorganizing everything he had filed under the category of who this woman in jeans at the bar was. I watched him do it. He looked at me differently now. He was really looking. He said, "What's your name, ma'am?" I set my glass down on the bar. I took out my military identification. I held it out to him. He read it. The color left his face in the way that I could see clearly in the bar light. He straightened. He said, "Commander Cooper, you wrote the NSW K9 integration manual. You're the one who placed every dog in the teams." Behind him, Dex Morales came to attention without being told, without being asked, without anything being communicated except the evidence in front of him and the name on the identification card. The bartender had stopped what he was doing. The nearest tables had gone quiet. Jake Halverson said, "Ma'am, I apologize." He meant considerably more than the dog, and we both knew it. I looked at him for a moment. Then I looked at Marco. He was sitting very still on the bar stool beside me with his drink in both hands, and an expression I had never seen on his face before. It was not embarrassment, exactly. Embarrassment is too simple and too easy for what he was carrying in that moment. It was something older and heavier than that. He had watched a bar full of military personnel come to attention for the woman sitting beside him, the same woman he had chuckled at 20 minutes before, and he could not find a single word. I looked back at Ranger, who was pressed against my leg, with the unambiguous certainty of an animal who is exactly where he belongs and has no interest in being anywhere else. I scratched behind his ears, the way I had done 10,000 times in the Lackland kennels. I let the moment stand without adding anything to it. Nothing needed to be said. The dog had already said it. We drove home mostly in silence. The freeway was quiet at that hour, and Marco tried 3 separate times to find the beginning of a sentence, and 3 times it dissolved before he could finish it. I was not closing him out. I simply needed to know what I actually felt before I handed him a version of it. Because giving him the wrong response would cost both of us more than waiting. He said, "Samantha?" I didn't mean to. I wasn't thinking. I said, "I know." He said, "I should have said something to them when they—" I said, "Marco." I know. He hadn't been malicious. I understood that then, and I understand it now. He had laughed because the person next to him laughed, and he had not paused to think about who the person on his other side was. Carelessness is its own statement about who you have decided matters enough to be careful with. He had made that statement without intending to, and it had been heard. I drove home and sat at my kitchen table with a glass of water for a long time after Marco went to bed. I was not angry in the way that anger usually feels, sharp and hot and forward-moving. I was tired in the very specific way of someone who has been carrying a weight for so long they have stopped noticing it until a particular moment requires them to set it down and look at it. I was tired of the gap between who I was at work, what I had built and overseen and achieved over 17 years in service, and who I was allowed to be when I walked through the front door of my own family's house. The 2 seals in the corner were incidental. My brother sitting beside me and laughing was not. The next morning, Marco was quieter than he had been all week. He made coffee, brought me a cup without being asked, and we sat on the balcony and watched the bay move from gray to pale blue in the early light. He said, "I didn't know you trained the dog. I didn't know any of it." I said, "You never asked." He sat with that without deflecting, which was new. There was a long pause before he responded. I want to note what he did not do in that pause. He did not reach for the list of reasons why he hadn't asked. He didn't offer the deadlines, the distance, the different texture of their respective lives. He sat with the fact that I had named, and he let it be a fact rather than something to be managed. It was a small thing, and it was also, between us, enormous. I had spent nearly 2 decades waiting for someone in my family to simply let a true thing be true without immediately building a structure around it. Marco let it be true. He sat there in the early morning light with his coffee, and he let it be true. And that was, by some distance, the most significant thing he had done in our adult lives. Marco had his father's gift for reframing, for finding the angle that made uncomfortable things into something he could live with. This time he didn't reach for it. He let the words stand as they were and sat inside what they meant. I didn't push. Some things need to be sat with rather than resolved, and I had learned the difference. I walked along the waterfront that afternoon alone while Marco caught up on work calls. I thought about my father. I thought about whether he was capable of hearing the truth about my career, or whether he would find a way to filter it through the frame he had always used, the army frame, the enlisted frame, the frame where what I had done was a lesser version of something he recognized. I called Diana Cruz, my closest colleague in the program, lieutenant commander, and someone who had known me through 8 years of deployments and 3 promotions. She listened without interrupting until I ran out of things to say. She said, "You've been carrying this your whole career." I said, "I thought I was past needing them to get it." She said, "Maybe you are. But that doesn't mean it doesn't still hurt." I came home to find Marco asleep on the couch with the television playing quietly and his shoes still on the floor. He looked younger than 33. He looked like the kid who used to fall asleep in front of football games at 14, while our father sat in the armchair behind him and watched. I turned off the television and left him a blanket and went to bed. By the following afternoon, I had made a decision. I was going to tell Marco, as much as I could within classification limits, but enough. Enough to let him stand in the actual room of my career rather than the outline of it he had been standing outside for 17 years. I had kept the door closed because he hadn't knocked, and he hadn't knocked because I hadn't indicated the door existed. And we had both circled the silence long enough that it had started to look like a permanent feature. I took the unclassified version of the NSWK9 integration manual from my desk, 342 pages, 14 months of early mornings, and set it on the kitchen table in front of him. He picked it up, read the cover, found the author line. He said, "You wrote this." I said, "Every word." He turned the pages without reading them, cover to cover, getting the weight of the thing, the architecture of it, the size of what he was holding, the training protocols, the integration frameworks, the deployment criteria, and operational application studies. I told him about Ranger's training timeline, about what it actually takes to produce a SEAL support working dog from 8 weeks old to full operational certification, the drives you look for at selection, the bond you build through thousands of hours of daily work, the precise calibration of an animal capable of operating in environments that would overwhelm a human being in minutes. I did not tell him what I could not tell him, but I gave him enough that he could feel the weight of it. I watched his face while I talked, not quite surprise, something more uncomfortable than that. The recalibration of a man discovering that a room he thought he knew had an entire wall he had never noticed, and that the wall had been there the whole time. He said, "Why didn't you ever tell me any of this?" I said, "Because you never made space for it. Every time I called, you asked if I was seeing anyone, or when I was getting out. Not what I was working on." He did not argue with that. He didn't reframe it or deflect it or find the angle that made it easier to sit with. He just let it be true. That evening, he called our father from my apartment while I read in the other room. I could hear the single side of the conversation, Marco's voice patient and deliberate, walking Carlos through the bar. The dog. What had happened. What it meant. I heard Carlos through the phone in brief pieces, and then a long silence, and then more of Marco's explanation. When Marco came back to the kitchen, he said, "He's going to call you." I said, "I know." He said, "He's proud of you, Samantha. He just doesn't know how to be." I didn't answer. But later, after he'd gone to bed, I stood in my study and looked at the manual on the shelf. I had filed it there years ago as a work document among work documents. That night, I looked at it as something else, as evidence not of what I'd accomplished, but of who I was. The person I had been quietly and steadily becoming for 17 years, while my family described me by what they could not see. The bar incident moved through the Coronado community the way small stories move through closed and attentive communities, quietly, sideways, in pieces, by Tuesday becoming something that certain people knew, and by the following week becoming something that certain people had formed opinions about. I did not know any of this for 2 weeks. I found out when my administrative coordinator, Petty Officer Second Class Williams, mentioned over morning coffee that 2 operators from SEAL Team 3 had formally requested my official contact information to submit a written apology through official channels. I read it when it arrived. Jake Halverson had written 2 careful paragraphs. They were clear and direct, without the hedging language that formal apologies sometimes use to insulate the writer from what they're saying. He said he apologized for his conduct and his partners. He said it had been inconsistent with the standards of his community and his own character. He said that his respect for the K-9 program and for my work was not adequately expressed by the document, but that it deserved to be stated in writing because some things do. I read it twice and filed it in my desk drawer alongside things I have decided to keep. In early December, my father called. The conversation started with the weather. It always starts with the weather, and then he said, "Marco told me what happened." At the bar, I said, "Yeah." He said, "That dog, Ranger. You trained him from the beginning?" I said, "From 8 weeks old." There was a long pause, longer than the weather pause. Then he told me something I had not expected. He said that his grandfather had kept a working dog his whole adult life. A mutt named Corazon, medium-sized, no particular breed. The kind of dog that shows up on a ranch and earns its place through character rather than pedigree. His grandfather had taken Corazon everywhere. When the dog died, his grandfather had not spoken about it. He had simply gone quieter for a while, the way men of that generation went quiet about the things that mattered most to them. He wasn't apologizing. I want to be clear about what I mean by that because the distinction matters. Carlos Cooper does not apologize in direct terms. It is not part of the vocabulary he built over 62 years and 3 Army tours. But he was building something in that conversation, a bridge out of material he understood, the complete and uncomplicated loyalty of a working animal toward something he was trying to understand. which was the life his daughter had built around that same quality in herself. I held the line open and let him work. Marco called the following week to say he had signed up to volunteer with a veterans outreach organization in San Antonio. He mentioned it briefly and without ceremony, just wanted me to know. I thanked him. I let it be what it was. Word of the bar continued to move through the SEAL community in the organic, untraceable way that such things move. My counterpart at the Army K-9 program called to say he had heard the story from someone at Team 3. The program's visibility inside naval special warfare increased in ways I could measure in the quality of attention I received in meetings, not deference, which I had never needed and do not want, but genuine interest. People who had known the program's work in the abstract were now paying attention to the person doing it. I stayed late one Friday evening in December, working through the next year's cohort assignment files. The building was quiet around me. When I finished, I turned off the desk lamp and drove home through streets lined with Christmas lights, and I was not thinking about the bar. It had already moved into the past where it belonged. Marco flew back for Christmas. He came alone, and intentionally, just the two of them, a decision he had made rather than a trip that had happened. He had a list of questions in his phone's notes app. I discovered this accidentally when he showed me his screen while searching for a restaurant address, and I saw the items he had typed before flying. Ask about the SEAL teams. Ask about the K-9 program budget. Ask about the dogs she's trained. Ask about the promotions. He had written it out because he did not trust himself to remember once he arrived. He was, for the first time in our adult lives, preparing to be interested in my life on purpose. I noticed this and said nothing about it and let him have the dignity of the effort. He had brought tamales from my mother, 2 dozen, wrapped carefully in foil inside a small cooler he had carried through 2 connecting flights. I laughed when I saw them, a real laugh, the first in several weeks. I took him to the training facility the day before Christmas Eve, the parts I could show him. The kennels, the obstacle courses, the open areas where handlers ran their dogs, through certification drills in the long, cool December afternoon light. He stood at the fence with his hands in his jacket pockets and watched a young handler running a retrieval exercise with a German shepherd and was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "These dogs are serious." I said, "Rangers' team cleared a building in 2023 that would have taken the SEAL operators at least 20 minutes to clear safely on their own. Ranger found the secondary explosive device in 4. Marco said, "And you taught him to do that." I said, "I gave him the foundation. The handler builds on it over years of partnership. But the foundation is everything. It's where the work either holds or it doesn't." He nodded without performing understanding. He was arriving at it through the specific evidence in front of him, the dog and the handler moving together with the coordinated precision of 2 things that have learned each other completely, and the arrival felt real. I tried to explain my career in abstract terms over the years, and it had never quite landed. Here, standing at a fence in December light, it landed. Christmas dinner was pasta from my mother's recipe, eaten at a table Marco helped me set, with a video call to Carlos and Rosa propped against the centerpiece. My father asked real questions, not surface ones. How K-9 assets were integrated into direct action scenarios. How the training protocols differed from conventional detection and patrol work. Whether the dogs maintained handler-specific bonds or team-wide bonds through operational deployment cycles. I answered one question at a time, without rushing. And he listened the way I had watched him listen to things he respected throughout my childhood. Without interrupting, leaning slightly forward, taking it in with the attention he had always given to the things he decided deserved it. It was the first conversation in years that felt like 2 people actually talking to each other rather than exchanging managed versions of themselves. After the call, Marco and I sat with wine. He looked at his glass for a long moment. He said, "I'm sorry, Samantha. For all the times I didn't ask." I said, "I know." He said, "Is that enough?" I said, "It's a start." I gave him no easy absolution. Not as punishment, he understood that and accepted it, but because some things need more than a single conversation to become genuinely real. He was willing to do the work of earning it back, which was new, and that willingness was more meaningful to me than any particular words he could have offered. I was going to let it grow into what it became. There is a particular kind of repair that happens between people who have known each other since childhood and hurt each other through inattention rather than intention. It is slower than the repair that follows a deliberate wound because deliberate wounds have clear edges and the work of healing them is correspondingly clear. What Marco and I were repairing was vaguer than that. We were repairing the accumulated effect of years of choosing the easier path in small moments, his laughter in the bar being only the most recent and most visible instance of something that had been happening between us for a long time. That kind of repair is not a single conversation, it is a direction. You agree to travel in it, and you check periodically to confirm you are still traveling in the same direction, and if you do that consistently enough, you eventually find that the distance is closed. We had set out in that direction. I was going to let it close at its own pace. We fell asleep watching a movie we had loved as children, the kind that works better as a memory than as a film, but that carries everything good about the memory right along with it. When I woke in the early morning, Marco had gone to the guest room and someone had laid a blanket over me that I did not remember getting. I folded it and left it on the arm of the couch so I would see it in the morning. January of 2026. I went back to work with a different quality of quiet than I had carried before. Not the silence of having nothing to say, but the stillness of a person who has stopped bracing for an impact that has already landed and been fully absorbed. The program was in its strongest cohort cycle since I had taken over the directorship. The dogs coming through were exceptional across the board. The integration framework from the 4th edition of the manual had been adopted as standard procedure across the teams, and the field feedback was the kind that matters most to me. Specific, operational, confirming that what I had designed was working the way I had designed it to work. Captain Warren Hayes stopped by my office on a Tuesday morning in the 3rd week of January. Precise man, deliberate with words, someone who said what he meant and nothing beyond it. He said, "Your O6 board paperwork went up this week. You're well positioned. Record is clean. Program metrics are exceptional. The recommendation from Warcom came in strong." I thanked him and went back to the cohort files. Not because the promotion was unimportant, it was important deeply in the way that 17 years of work being formally acknowledged is important. But I had learned at some point in this career not to hold my breath for outcomes I could not control. The work was within my reach. The board's decision was entirely beyond it. I focused on what I could influence and left the rest alone. In February, I briefed senior leadership at Naval Special Warfare Command on K9 integration metrics and program outcomes across 3 years. 4 admirals in the room, 2 captains, a deputy from the Pentagon. I had prepared for 2 weeks, not because the material was uncertain, but because the people in any briefing room deserve the fullest version of what you know, and preparation is how you honor that. The briefing ran 45 minutes. I answered every question asked and several that had not yet been formulated. Afterward, walking to my vehicle in the command building parking lot, I heard someone behind me. Jake Halverson was standing beside a government vehicle. He saw me and came to attention immediately. "Commander Cooper, Petty Officer Halverson." We shook hands. He told me Ranger had been the top-performing K9 asset in 3 consecutive training exercises since November. He told me the team had integrated a new pre-deployment protocol based on the manual's 4th edition. He said his written apology had been sincere, every word of it. I said, "I know." He nodded once, the precise, compact nod of someone who has said what needed to be said and trusts it has been received. We walked to our vehicles. I thought, walking to my car, about the version of Jake Halverson who had sat in a corner booth and made a calculation about who I was based on nothing but my clothes and my posture, and the fact that I was in a room he thought of as his. He had been wrong in the way that people are wrong when they mistake visibility for significance. The version of him standing in this parking lot had corrected that error and was carrying the correction properly, without drama and without diminishment. That took something. I recognized it because I had spent years watching operators handle hard information about themselves in the field, and the ones who handled it well were the ones worth keeping in your corner. I drove away feeling lighter than I had in a while, not because I required his acknowledgement, but because it confirmed that what had happened in the bar had been real for him too. That it had changed something. That the work, in being seen, had mattered in that small and specific way, in addition to all the other ways it mattered. A letter arrived from my father in early March. Handwritten on the lined notebook paper he had used his entire life. 2 full pages, front and back, the handwriting more careful than his usual hurried script. He wrote about Corazon, his grandfather's working dog, the animal who had stayed at his grandfather's side through hard country for years, loyal in the specific and uncomplicated way that working animals are loyal, asking nothing and giving everything. He wrote that hearing my voice on the phone recently made him think of Corazon, that I had the same quality in my voice, steady, reliable, present when needed, and never performing when not. He said he thought he had not understood before the bar what I had actually spent my life building. He said he thought he understood better now. He did not write the words, "I am sorry." He was 62 years old with 3 army tours behind him and a lifetime of keeping the most important things just below the surface. And this was as close as he could come. He had written 2 pages to arrive at the approximate territory of an apology, and that was more than I had ever had from him before, and I decided without any particular difficulty that it was enough. I folded the letter and put it in the drawer where I keep the things I have genuinely earned. Ranger's retirement paperwork came through in the first week of April. He had sustained a leg injury during a February training exercise. Not serious, not surgical, no threat to the quality of a normal life, but enough to end operational deployment status under SEAL Team readiness protocols. The program formally recommended retirement to pet status. His handler filed the paperwork. I filed the adoption application the same afternoon I received the notification. There was no deliberation involved. The answer had been obvious for 3 years. His retirement ceremony was held at the canine facility on a Tuesday morning, small and appropriate in scale, attended by the people who had worked with him and cared for him. Jake Halverson stood with his team for the final time, with Ranger at his side. There were brief remarks. Ranger sat through them with the characteristic alertness of a trained working dog, ears cataloging the room systematically, body still, attention comprehensive and complete, as though this too were a mission, and he had not yet been relieved of it. When the ceremony ended and the handlers stepped forward to say their goodbyes, I came forward from the back of the room. Ranger heard me before he could have seen me. His ears rotated first, then the rest of him followed, the way it always had and always would, across any distance, through any noise, past any competing instruction. He came to me without hesitation, without hurry, with the absolute certainty of an animal who has located exactly what it was looking for. I knelt down and held his face in my hands the way I had on his first morning at Lackland when he was 8 weeks old and uncertain of everything except the instinct to engage. The handlers behind him were watching, some of them people I knew and had worked alongside for years. They watched Ranger come to me, and none of them looked surprised. The working dog community is small and attentive, and the story of the bar had traveled through it in the months since November, and I think what they were watching in that moment was not a surprise, but a confirmation that the bond I had described in the 4th edition of the integration manual. The bond that forms in those early training weeks and does not fully dissolve regardless of how many subsequent handlers and assignments and years intervene, was real in the specific and observable way. Ranger coming to me across the room was its own kind of evidence. The same evidence the bar had been. He was 4 years old now. He was certain of very little except this moment and the hands holding his face. By the end of April, Ranger had cleared the facility's security requirements for office animals and was spending most mornings under my desk. He lay with his chin on my foot while I drafted curriculum. He lifted his head when my voice changed register in phone calls. He came to full alert whenever someone knocked on the office door, always prepared, never required, entirely content with the situation as presented. He did not replace the work, nothing replaces the work, and I would not want it to. But he changed the texture of the days in the way that a steady presence always changes the texture of things. The promotion notification arrived on a Wednesday morning in late April. Captain 06, effective the 1st of June, 2026. I read the email twice. I sent a brief, formal acknowledgement. I closed my laptop. I sat in the quiet of my office with the morning light coming through the window and Ranger asleep at my feet, and I simply let it be real. I had spent 17 years building toward something. Not this notification. The notification was a confirmation, not an endpoint. What I had been building toward, I understood then, was simpler and more durable than a rank. It was a life that felt entirely like my own, a body of work done with full attention and without apology, in service of something that mattered, in rooms where almost no one knew my name and the mission required it to stay that way. I had built that. I had built it quietly and maintained it over years, and sent dogs into the field that had saved lives I will never know the names of. And I had done all of it without needing anyone to see it. The work had found its own way to be seen, through a Belgian Malinois who crossed a bar to find me by the sound of my voice, alone. I thought about my father reading the news segment with me when I was 16, the particular dismissal in his voice when he said soft. I thought about what I would say to that 16-year-old version of my father now, if I could. I thought I would tell him to watch more carefully. To watch what happens when a trained military working dog crosses a room on nothing but a voice, no command, no incentive, no coercion of any kind. To watch that and then tell me again that it is soft. The things that bind without coercion are not the soft things. They are the hardest things in the world to build and the most difficult to break. I had spent 17 years building something that held. My father needed a letter from a dog to understand it. I found, walking along the waterfront in April, that I was grateful for that letter, rather than frustrated by how long it had taken to arrive. That evening I walked along the waterfront at dusk, Ranger moving at my side with the loose, unhurried gait of an animal who has been given back his freedom and knows exactly what to do with it. The bay was quiet. The light was going gold off the water in the way it does in San Diego in April, the particular gold of the Pacific coast at that hour, the kind that makes everything it touches look like something worth keeping. I thought about the bar, the voice across the room, the laugh from the bar stool beside me, the echo of both of those things inside my chest, and found that it had gone quiet, not erased, not forgotten, resolved. The way pain resolves when what caused it has been properly addressed, and you have stopped pressing it to see if it still hurts. What was left was the particular lightness of a life that had finally, completely become my own. Ranger pressed against my leg as we walked, mirroring exactly what he had done 6 months earlier in a bar near Coronado. When he had crossed a room on nothing but the sound of a voice and found me without hesitation, I reached down and rested my hand on his back. He leaned into it, the way he always had, the way he always would. We walked until the light left the water, and the city came on behind us, and the bay went dark, and neither of us was in any particular hurry to be anywhere else. The things you build with integrity always leave a mark, even when you never see where they land. You just have to be patient enough to wait for them to find their way back to you. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes they do. Ranger is asleep under my desk right now as I'm thinking about how to wrap this up. And I keep coming back to this, the most important things I ever built. Nobody outside of a very small world could see. 17 years. Hundreds of training sessions. A manual that now runs across every SEAL team. And it took a dog crossing a bar on nothing but instinct for the people closest to me to understand what any of it meant. I'm not sure I would change that, even if I could. There's something clarifying about doing the work without an audience. But if this one resonated with you, if you've ever been quietly underestimated by someone sitting right next to you, I really want to hear your story. Drop it in the comments. What was the moment they finally saw it? And if you haven't subscribed yet, hit subscribe and the bell.